My great pleasure to introduce today's chair is Jennifer Isasi. Is an assistant research professor of digital scholarship at the Pennsylvania State University, where she acts as director of the Digital Liberal Arts Research Initiative. This position establishes a research methodologies community at PCU to articulate and integrate digital research in projects in the humanities and social sciences. Jen also collaborates with the Center for Black Digital Research at PCU Libraries to organize hybrid events and training opportunities. She's also the current managing editor for Programming Historian en Español, a journal in which she has collaborated since 2018. She holds a PhD in Hispanic Studies with a specialization in digital humanities from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And welcome all. And thank you for leading today's discussion, Jennifer. The floor is now all yours.
Thank you, Ana Maria, and Michael, who's not here. Thanks for inviting me to moderate this panel, this interesting talk today about failure and everything that has to do with that and digital humanities. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. I see people who I know are in the US as well, and many that I guess are somewhere in Europe. Today we have 5 panelists that will be sharing their knowledge and ideas with us. And I'm going to introduce them in no particular order. First, we have Brittany or Britt Amell. Her is a scholar and practitioner who is enthusiastic about using academic literacies and social rhetorical theories of writing to study different ways of producing and communicating knowledge in and beyond academic contexts. Her interest in the notion of academic failures represents the next step in a series of inquiry projects that have included research on the experiences Indigenous students had with academic writing, the links between belonging, creativity, and knowledge production, imposter feelings, and the relationship to context of higher education and practices of advanced academic literacies, and more recently on unconventional dissertations, including examining what they are and how they are brought about, with the latter being the focus of her recently defended PhD dissertation. Congratulations for that, Britt. Then we also have Nabeel Siddiqui, him, who is an assistant professor of digital humanities and associate director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the Susquehanna University, a couple of hours away from me, actually only. He also serves as an English editor for the Programming Historian team and is completing 2 manuscripts. The first, entitled Cultural Data Analytics in R, A Tidy Approach, explores how scholars in the digital humanities and media studies can utilize computational methodologies such as network analysis, multivariate regression, natural language processing, and neural networks in the R programming languages to study phenomena in cases where close qualitative research is prohibited or misleading. And the second book he's working on is titled The Computer Comes Home, A Failed Revolution, in which he analyzes the personal computer's domestication in America during the 1970s and the 1980s. In addition to his more traditional scholarly pursuits, he has worked on numerous digital humanities projects. Then we have Annika Rockenberger, who works as a senior academic librarian for digital research methods in the humanities and social sciences at the University of Oslo Library. Annika has a background in literary studies, history, and communication science, specializing in textual scholarship and book history. She earned her master's from Free University Berlin and her PhD from the University of Oslo with a thesis proposing an analytic philosophy of modern German textual scholarship. Having worked at universities and libraries in Germany and Norway, Annika sees herself as a DH activist, co-founding the Berlin DH Stammtisch in 2010, founding the DH network at the University of Oslo in 2013, and co-founding the Digital Humanities in the Nordic and Baltic countries in 2015, which she now serves as chair for the term 2021-2024, and as a co-organizer for the DHMB 2023 online conference, whose topic is sustainability, environment, community, and data. Then we have Janneke Adema, she, her. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Okay, thanks. Who's a cultural and media theorist working in the fields of book publishing and digital culture. She is an associate professor in digital media at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University. In her research, she explores the future of scholarly communications and experimental forms of knowledge production, where her work incorporates processual and performative publishing, radical open access, post-publishing, scholarly poetics, media studies, book history, cultural studies, and critical theory. She explores this issue in depth in her various publications, but also by supporting a variety of scholar-led, not-for-profit publishing projects, including the Radical Open Access Collective, Open Humanities Press, Open Book Collective, and Post Office Press, and the Research England and Arcadia-funded community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs projects, on which she is a co-PI. Her monograph, Living Books, Experiments in the Post-Humanities, is openly available. And finally, we have Gabby Boddard, he, him, who is a reader in digital classics at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. His background is in digital research and publication of materials from the ancient world, in particular Greek and Latin inscriptions and papyri, geography and prosopography, and 3D imaging of historical material culture. He has worked extensively with DEI XML for encoding ancient texts, and is a leader author of the EpiDoc guidelines, style sheets, and schema. He's one of the program directors of Sunquehanna's Digital Classics. I hope I pronounced that more or less correctly, an online consortium of digital classics instructors and students from more than 90 institutions from all around the world. He teaches in digital classics and digital approaches to cultural heritage, and his recent work focuses on ethical issues around intellectual property, open source, and 3D. So with that, we are going to start the conversation. For the audience, I will point out that I'm going to be asking questions to different panelists. They will respond in 3-5 minutes. We're asking them to keep it to the hour, and then we will proceed to Q&A. So I'm going to start saying that perhaps the best place to start is discussing how we communicate about expectations in the digital humanities, since it's not new, but still there are a lot of people who don't know very well what this is. And usually we have to explain this both at the beginning and the end of the projects, right? So Annika, I wanted to ask if you could talk about how you recommend that researchers anticipate failure that could take place, right? And take necessary steps to hand over the projects to an unknown future researcher or the public, and how will those steps differ for the two different potential new owners, in quotes, of the projects? Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hi, everybody. It's actually it's a very interesting question. And what would you recommend people do in order to anticipate failure? Because it's something that we both always have to anticipate, because we can fail always, all the time, with anything, and it doesn't even have to be our fault that we fail. But we also can't. It can't make us stop wanting to try out things, stop investigating, or stop daring. So I would say, as a very kind of concrete suggestion, is that you must anticipate failure already as part of your risks and mitigations analysis that you have to do when you're planning a project. So once you have the idea and you start into the planning process, this has to be something that you address with yourself, with your collaborators, with your potential stakeholders. Like, okay, so what are we going to do if that happens? But also really practically, so how do we design a project? How do we design a digital humanities project? They are often by nature interdisciplinary. They are by nature having technological component that can be very experimental or can be very vulnerable because of it being a one-person issue or so. So in this kind of design, I think we can help communicating potential or possible failure by, for example, pre-registering our research questions, our hypotheses. This is something that is rather uncommon in the, it's very uncommon in the humanities. It is not very common in the digital humanities, but more. It is much more common in social sciences, in medicine, and so on, in the what we consider to be the hard sciences, even though I don't really buy into that distinction. But it could be something where we at least let the scientific community know before we even have started, oh, this is something someone is going to investigate. And it can also help, for example, preventing failure. People can come and say, okay, sounds interesting, but so we might get this this important dialogue going to prevent failure also. But even if we never get the funding, so we consider that the failure of the project, or the project gets stuck or whatever, the hypothesis is out there, some clarifications, framings around there, which will help other people being able to find that there is a project, and then also to kind of pick up and see, is this something I want to investigate on these terms? So carrying out someone else's research because they couldn't for whatever reasons, or saying, that sounds interesting, but I'd rather do something like it, or closely related to it, or developing further on it. So making it also clear that projects can kind of be carried on or live on different terms, on someone else's terms, and thus maybe not disappear. And maybe another thing I can mention is, it's actually, I haven't come up with that. I read it many years ago in a blog by Scott Weingart, a very known digital humanities person, where he talks about iterative publishing. So instead of doing the, okay, only when the project is done, we do the big publication, be it the article, be it the website for a project, the big database, or the book. By all means, we're still in the humanities, so books are something that we create. And instead doing constant production of some of your assumptions, of your processes, of your data collection, and so on and so forth. So this can also be something that helps others picking up where you left off, or seeing why you had to abandon a project, or why something failed, because they can see, okay, maybe here something didn't go as anticipated, or went into a direction that was unfortunate. But I want to name, I can't really elaborate on it because I'm not a specialist in that field. I think when we talk about failure and expectations, it's something very personal. So what would the personal impact be on you as the principal investigator, the researcher, or even a part of the team, if something were to fail? Is that something that you are okay with personally? Like, I didn't manage to X, or I had to abandon my wonderful pet project. because of X. What is the professional impact? It can be very, very important. Something that doesn't personally hurt me might hurt me professionally, and I might want to kind of make this part of my considerations. What are the means? Or it might be on the opposite. It's a personal, much more personal impact than it actually is on the professional one, especially for us who are in the privileged position of having permanent positions, well-paid institutions, well-funded institutions. Professional impact is not so much. And then I called it kind of world impact. And here I have to say, in our fields, often when projects fail, it's not such of a big deal. So also being a bit realistic about what if it fails, what if it gets abandoned, it's often not so much of a tragedy for other than the people involved, even though it's might be a big tragedy for them. But I think that is an important part of the expectation management and of the preparation one should do when thinking about failure and failure in research projects, especially in the digital humanities.
Thank you, Annika. And tying that idea of expectation management, right? And how we already have our PhDs, we have our jobs, but when it comes to student, Gabby, I wanted to ask you, what are the challenges of managing their student expectations, how to manage that when starting assess work might end up showing negative results? How do we manage that, especially for students who are non-DH students or are not aware that they are doing DH maybe? How do we manage that?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question. My starting point was that I never use the word failure when talking about any of the things that we're talking about here, especially when talking with students, because we really, I mean, as you say, negative results. So, you know, as in the sciences, you know, we're doing a project, we're doing an experiment, and what comes out of it is a result. And whether it's the result we were expecting, whether it's the result we were hoping, whether it's a result that enables us to write a good article about it or not, it's still a result. And that can be difficult for students to handle, especially, as you say, students in the humanities, I mean, the more traditional humanities. And so, you know, I teach mostly digital classics, and I've taught it as classics to DH students and as DH to classics students, but it's largely the same thing. And the challenge has always been exactly that, in terms of their expectations and understanding, you know, what it means to do an exercise, to do a project that is assessed, and that they don't know at the beginning what the outcome is going to be. You know, if you ask a student to write an essay, they sort of know what they're arguing from the beginning. I always try to be very, very clear, and I always have tried to be extremely clear from the very start that this is an experiment, and unlike your history essay, you won't be judged on whether you discover anything new about history in the process of doing this, right? Or whether you know, you're asking a question about history because that is the tool that you use to try out some digital humanities method and see whether that gives you any useful insight into that answer. And so your question could be, yes, this gave me some really useful insights, or it could be, no, it didn't give me any useful insights, right? Or it turned out to be too difficult to use for a project of this scale, or the learning curve was too steep, or it wasn't well documented enough, or it's a cloud-served tool that was too unstable at this point. All sorts of things that you might give as negative results to that sort of question. Like I say, I've always tried to be very clear that you know, if the answer is no, it's not useful, that in no way, you know, equates to a lower mark, right? But the first time I taught this, which was probably about 10 years ago, in that form, and I had people do this sort of exercise where they did that, you know, whether they might have had a negative result. One of the students was very clearly getting a negative result, panicked, rather than talking to me, went to see their personal tutor, who was a digital humanities lecturer, who in turn panicked, and rather than talking to me, went to the head of department and said, it's absolutely outrageous that he's giving students a project to do that they might fail through no fault of their own. So there's clearly a whole range of people here who are misunderstanding, and obviously this was partly my fault for not having explained well enough to the student that that wasn't going to be a fail, but nevertheless there is a whole range of misunderstanding going along that led to that, which is why I don't say this just once now. I say this 20 times to students before they do it, and I haven't had that degree of complaint since. But it is a challenge, and so I can say, fine, I'm going to be marking this, and there's going to be an external mark examiner or whatever, and they all know that this is that sort of experiment, and you're not going to be penalised so long as you can still say intelligent things about it for having failed to work out how to use QGIS, because it's a difficult tool to use, right? But how I mean, we need to be honest with students about not only about their current piece of work, but about how useful an approach this is going to be across their study and across their career. Is it still true if the master's student who I teach this takes the same approach in their PhD and ends up with a negative result? Are they still going to have a PhD that is going to pass? Are they still going to have a PhD that is publishable? Are they still going to have a monograph that is good enough that it gets them tenure or gets them a job? Those sort of questions we have to be, and I think the answer in digital humanities, the answer probably is yes, so long as they take the right approach to it. I examined a PhD recently that had fully half of it was a negative result, and this was in a traditional discipline, as in not in DH. And fully half of it was a negative result, saying I set out to try and prove this, and that turned out not to be the case. And so I have no actual conclusions for this, except that this wasn't the right approach to take. And both me and the traditional linguists who were examining this were both like, that's absolutely fine. But we both sort of felt maybe we were a bit unusual in saying that was absolutely fine. But so we do. I think that it's a question that we have to be clear what we're saying to students, how true it is that it's okay to have a negative result, and I don't think it's a very easy answer.
Thank you, Gabby, and that ties very well to my next question, because you already mentioned the fact that as instructors, as professors, we are teaching students, we can tell them it's okay to fail in the experiments that you're going to carry out in the class. You're not going to fail the class, but what happens when then we are expected to be publishing research, and the publishers, the different journals, right, are not usually going to publish articles about something that failed, at least not in the most long-running traditional journals, right? So Janneke, you've done this work on experimental publishing processes and different types of publishing and content of this research. So given often the high stakes associated with publishing research, and we have to publish to keep having our jobs, how do you talk about the failures involved in those experiments of this experimental publishing?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. It's a hard question, because I think, well, first to maybe start a little bit on what we do or what I kind of see as experimental publishing. So I think that's, on the one hand, it's kind of experimenting with new forms and formats of publishing. So thinking about adding multimedia or kind of databases to publications and trying to incorporate them. But it's also very much about rethinking the relationalities of publishing. So the way that we disseminate and produce work, and how we do that increasingly in different settings than in a print environment. And that the kind of work that we're doing within, data-driven humanities, digital humanities, social sciences, requires us to rethink the way that we have been publishing, right? So a lot of the projects that I'm involved in are trying to do exactly that. They're trying to experiment with the ways that we publish and to kind of rethink what publishing is. And for me, experimenting in that sense is very much a trying out. It's a testing out. And that inherently has to involve an openness towards failure, right? Because we're exploring, we're asking questions about how the current systems are set up, and we're trying to think of and experiment and perform new ways of doing things. And we're up against a system that, you know, has taken some time to be implemented, and it's become quite dominant and hegemonic, as we're aware of. So it's hard to kind of think of alternatives, and also to do that in a setting in which, like what we've already discussed, you know, the print output-based monographs, articles of a specific format model is incredibly dominant. So doing something different within that is hard, right? It's hard for academics, it's hard for publishers, etc. But I think it's so important to kind of keep on focusing on, indeed, on trying out and testing and exploring new options. And the ways that we've kind of been dealing with, because of course in that context a lot of things don't work, right? Because we're trying out, we're trying out new platforms that people are maybe not familiar with. We're working with lots of new, you know, agencies within the publishing process. All of a sudden we've got developers, designers, people that are not, you know, traditionally part of a publishing process. So one of the things that we've been trying to do to kind of promote more experimentation with publishing is to have extensive documentation around the projects that we're doing. So we're trying to share as much as possible what we've been doing, how we've been doing it, what went wrong, what can be done better. And I think this is also, you know, following on what Gabby was saying about failure is not necessarily failure, in a sense that it's often within publishing, it's more like, how can we improve things going forward? Things not working at this moment, there's often reasons for that, having to do with people not being familiar with new tools or processes, with, you know, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort and workload for people to kind of get into new forms of publishing. So we need to be aware of that. And at the same time, I think, you know, and that's, like, I guess the second half of my answer is that even though we need to be open towards failure and experimental publishing is in essence a response against a failing system, which is a dominant print hegemonic system that we're working on, which is not functioning anymore, and which is especially not working for digital humanities research, for all kinds of you know, print digital dichotomies, commercial not-for-profits. We're working in a system that's just not doing the things that we wanted to do as scholars. And so it's essential that we highlight that system is actually failing, and that we need to find better ways, more ethical ways of communicating and working on that together. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword in that sense, I would say.
Thank you. That's very interesting, because you mentioned there are a couple of things that I want to note to move into the next question, or to tie into the next question, which is, you said that some things in this experimental publishing format that you're working on, some things don't work in all the contexts, right? And at the same time, that experimenting is running against the more traditional publishing modes where we see it's failing, because there's not everyone gets the chance to write at the same pace. Not every humanities, in this case, journals accept all our digital humanities research, right? Then of course, a lot of journals are kind of crying out because they are not finding reviewers, because people don't have the time to review for free anymore. There's already research out there that during the pandemic, mostly everyone publishing during that time was male scholars only, etc. Right? So that's very interesting, because this gets me to the next question that I have here, but I'm going to add a little bit one myself, which is, who has the privilege of failing within the classroom, within this publishing system, right? So I think Britt might have some ideas there, because she has been researching, in particular, doctoral dissertations. It could be students or already PhDs, because one is always a student anyways. Britt, can you share some of your research looking at who fails, why, and the most important thing, I think, is who gets to rebrand this failure as successes in the context of dissertations, but it could be anything else that you've been seeing on your research.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for being here and inviting me. It's a great panel so far. I've been enjoying it. I think that this is a really great question. It's a loaded question in terms of who gets to rebrand their failures as successes. Let's step back for a moment and I'd like to kind of just frame it from my perspective as an applied linguist and discourse studies person. So I want to take a look not just at the individuals, but also at the sort of systems that they're in, the institutions that they're in, seeing these sort of events, or these failure events, as situated within nested and enmeshed contexts. Okay, so who can rebrand themselves as a success might depend very much on what sort of privileges their bodies carry with them, depending on the place that they're in. So, as a white coded person, a settler here in unceded territory in Canada, I might have some very different experiences with being able to take a so-called failure and tout it as a success. I might also have the ability to risk more, depending again on my sort of positionality and so forth. I want to also talk about and think a little bit more about, and this is, I think, what's been said already too, is seeing failure as a valid position. There are a lot of people, students, scholars, and so forth, who just by virtue of existing are, in some senses, casted as failures. They're whether they're failing to perform their gender role, failing to perform the sort of white stream scholar role, whether they're writing in a certain place, in a certain time, in a certain way that doesn't fit with the canon. There's just by virtue of existing this sort of sense of failure and of courting failure. And there's some conversation that's starting to happen both within my research and elsewhere. I mean, lots elsewhere, like, Black, Indigenous scholars, queer scholars, like there's been a lot of conversation around this there. That is just sort of saying, well, what if failure is actually an indication that something good is happening here? Like what if we want to fail? What if failure is the way that we understand that the resistance is not futile, so to speak. So I also want to caution too the sense of when we rebrand failure as success. In some ways that we do this are like, we might have failed, but at least we learned. We might have failed, but we made it productive somehow. And there's a difference for me in terms of being productive versus being generative. I'd like to see failures as generative. That's not necessarily always productive in the sort of neoliberal capitalist sense. But anyways, if we're rebranding these sort of failures as success, we're assuming that rubric of success is the one that we want to keep. You see, so we're assuming that by mapping this, I think at least, we're assuming by mapping failure onto success, it's like saying, well, great, there's nothing wrong with that. When actually, in fact, like you've already pointed out, that there's so many dimensions at play, the invisible labor. You yourself just mentioned there's a majority of publications that came out during the pandemic, male, and also the other half of that, the service positions, gendered female, doing the reviews and so forth, or sorry, gendered woman, female sex, woman gender. So just sort of thinking a little bit more along those lines for me I really want to see, yes, like any person doing sociological or sociological-esque research, there's always this tension between individual agency and the sort of collective social institution, and it's like so difficult to maintain a balance because we are individuals, but we're also in a system, in this sort of society. But I really do want to encourage that when we're thinking about failure, we're talking about discourses of failure as well, and that's language, that's communications, that's all within nested contexts. So I think that there might have been, there's one more thing that was brought up by Gabby, sorry. There's these tensions in terms of discourses. I feel like I like to call them pop failures. So the pop failures are like, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Or failure is not an option. Fail better, fail forward, fail harder. Like, good God, people, like, can we just let failure be failure? Not to disrespect anything that's been said here, just to present an alternative. There's this tension that exists in the higher education institution too, where in our classrooms we want to present experimentation. We want to, show that failure, may be an F word, and God, it's great to swear sometimes, and it doesn't have to change. We don't have to make it palatable. We can learn. We can have failure become generative, but then that becomes in tension, as was just with the discourses of failure at the institutional and the departmental level, where the prevailing is often failure is not an option. Failure is a very bad word. Failure is all these other things. But every time there's a failure event, so to speak, I really want to say, let's look at that as an indication. What is that pointing us to? What is that telling us about the sorts of ruptures and breakages in the quote unquote matrix or the system, places that are ripe for intervention, and seeing, like, almost, if you could, documenting and just taking note, like, oh, there's another example of where this isn't working. Every time there's a failure experience, I find that it's tied to something at that sort of systemic social level.
Thank you, Britt. A lot to think about. A lot of discourses, a lot of points of entry into the discourse of failure and how we approach it. And now Nabeel has some data, speaking of systems, right? And individuals within a system, whether we can call it like that or not, the Alliance of Digital Humanities is a system, an academic system of many groups working on mainly putting together the DH conference annually in different countries, usually switching from one continent to another. And Nabeel has been studying who attends the conference and who doesn't. So Nabeel, on a larger scale within this system of DH, you have been looking again at how the placement and structure of the conferences is sponsored by the ADHO excludes specific groups of scholars, whether it's explicit exclusion or not. It's just like, oh, we didn't think about that, or we can help everyone or whatnot, right? So can you share about some of your findings from that research and what you found? Who's not attending or who's attending everything organized by ADHO?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm really happy to be here and be with the other panelists here. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've been working on this kind of idea of, and it's research that's existed in other fields about sort of conferences as these sort of sites of power, right? We are sort of inundated with conferences all the time. They're sort of proposals that go out, how to get to them and stuff like that. And many of the conference proceedings are also then published as, many of the conference papers are then published in proceedings, and so people get sort of a publication out of many of them. And so who gets to be at these sites of power really has been a really important question, and one that I've been kind of grappling with. So about a few years ago, there was a couple of researchers put together the Index of DH Conferences, which is this large, massive data set that just looks at, all of the possible, they get basically all of the conference programs, and they put up who the individuals were and sort of their affiliations and stuff like that. So I thought that this was like a really interesting data set. And one thing I was interested in is like, okay, we have all this kind of data about who's been at these conferences for years. Like, where exactly do they use where exactly do they travel from? How much do they travel? Who's able to travel? And so you can think about this through sort of like what we might call like the mobilities paradigm, right? Mobility is also tied heavily towards ideas of power. And so you can think about, for example, in like the Southern United States, right? Movement between areas is very much restricted. And so how you get from one place to another is very important. So what I did was I was kind of grappling with this idea of how do we get to, how much people travel. And I thought about the fact that universities are not just places of education, but also really significant geographical locations, right? And so like any city you go to, like we have this idea in America, for example, of like college towns, but they have that kind of in Europe and stuff as well. And so what I found was, okay, if you take this sort of data about affiliations and reverse geocode it as a site of where this person came from, you could figure out kind of where their home origin is. Now, this assumes a little bit of blurriness in the sense that obviously some people travel from their work. They might be coming for about an hour or two out and they drive into work and stuff like that. But broadly, most people live somewhere near their work. And so I reverse geocoded all of these, and then I use that to look at I use that kind of data to look at where these people then moved, and if that travel changes for different people. And what I find actually, and this might be obvious to many people, but I thought it was kind of surprising to me, is like the most common movement is actually just like zero. Or roughly zero. And so what happens is that people that are presenting at a conference or are having conferences in that location will have graduate students and other people kind of present at that conference, or they'll sit on panels, or there'll be chairs of something like that. And so there's this kind of idea that, oh, in fact, many people can travel far, but that's not the case. In fact, most people just kind of stay in that region. And so international travel is almost prohibitively expensive for almost anyone that hasn't presented at a DH conference before. So one thing I also had was how many times has a person presented. So I use that sort of as a measure of their seniority in the field. Basically, if they had presented more at at DH conferences, the idea was that they were kind of senior in the field. And so people that were kind of new to the field, or were from areas that were not in the United States or really Europe, and sometimes Australia, really just don't ever travel to many of these conferences. And so ADHO, one of the sort of policies that ADHO has is this kind of place that they place this conference at. And they've been spending a lot of this effort on kind of expanding the amount of travel funding that people get, or to allow people to, kind of allowing junior scholars to present in certain formats and stuff like that. And what I found was, in fact, the location of the conference is the main thing that ADHO has been really much kind of perpetuating as a site of power for the digital humanities. And so, we could think about that as, the sort of failure of ADHO to sort of live up to its potential of bringing in scholars. And so, we can the recent conference is going to be in Austria, and so they for a long time also had just sort of rules about where people could like where ADHO could actually hold a conference, and those were coded specifically as Europe and the United States. And so the one that happened in Mexico was a big deal, and so you do see this drastic shift, and you don't actually even see that much of a drastic shift in online conferences. So online conferences, we still see some of the same sort of things, and I'm still trying to tease out why that is. But it seems like a lot of it is that the people that sort of hold the conference at a certain location have this power to bring in the scholars within that region. And so the US and Europe kind of do that. One of the things that I'll stop right after this. One of the things I'm kind of discussing is how to deal with questions of race and gender and how to get this out. So there's a lot of research from sort of post-colonial scholars. So like Rupika Rassam has a stuff on looking at ADHO and the DH conference stuff, and they use names and stuff to infer gender and race, which has sort of its own problematic issues in it. But I think there's a good point that, in fact, we oftentimes use these names not as sort of identity markers as the way the humanities students might have understand them, but really as stereotypes. And so this sort of inference kind of allows us to tease out that element and sort of deal with it in aggregate. So I also find that, in fact, what you might expect, women are less likely to travel large conference areas. People that are presented as keynote speakers, which tend to be largely white individuals or Asian individuals. We actually the ADO conferences have traditionally had keynote speakers that were also much more Asian, I think, than a lot of places. And so we have these kind of barriers in our field, which I think is a failure that we need to address.
Thank you, Nabeel. That is truly interesting. Because next year they are already organizing, right? Next year, so it will be interesting to see. Because I heard it's been a few years since the DH conference hasn't happened here in the US, so we'll see who gets to attend and who doesn't. So the next topic or questions come about. And it has to do somehow with the discourse of failure. It has to do somehow with the going to conferences and seeing who can present and who can not present. It's about, we all know that communicating failure, communicating that something hasn't worked out as we thought it would, or what we were expecting to get out of some experiment, it's difficult, it's complicated, especially for certain audiences, tenure colleagues who have done the tenure track on the traditional way, where they like publishing articles, publishing a book or two. Peer reviewers sometimes don't agree with the findings of a paper if it's fail and whatnot. So Janneke, because you're working the most on this scholarly publishing process, what has been the biggest challenge of academics engaging or trying to engage with this experimental aspect of publishing? What is the biggest challenge that you think academics have?
We've had a lot of challenges, I think. I think this mostly has to do with a lot of experimental publishing. We're trying to, again, rethink the ways that we have been doing publishing, which is mostly focused on single authorship, on standard fixed outputs, etc. And a lot of experimentation is currently happening with models that look at what Annika was saying, more kind of iterative inversions publishing, right? Showing the process within publishing, on more open forms of reviews, so things like open reviews, annotations, and also aspects that look at more communal forms of authorship and kind of presenting work that is often collaborative instead of like having that single individual original author connected to it. And all of this, again, which is a rethinking and experimenting with what this could look like, involves a lot of volunteer labor from people, right? And we're really, one of the things that we're working on also is promoting things like reuse, which is also not popular, of course, because we're kind of prone to create new, original kind of research. So what do you do with, all that's already out there, and how can we actually engage with that in a way that's interesting? So it's very hard to get people to engage with that, and there's lots of reasons for that. Again, yes, having to do with time and workload, having to do with unfamiliarity of platforms, and having to do, of course, with the fact that a lot of this kind of work around engagement or responding to reusing work is not acknowledged as a scholarship within the field. And so people do that in their extra time, in their spare time. And I think, what is important there is to again highlight that this is not failure, but this is a trying to move away from a system that we don't want. We don't want, it isn't working, the single author model, the outputs and performative based model. And it's moving towards a model that's more communal, ethical, that's focused on process and reuse. will involve a different way of engaging with scholarship and with publishing, and that will involve, you know, trying to rethink what scholarship is and what counts as scholarship, and what counts as research. So in that sense also, you know, a lot of the experiments that I'm involved with don't get a lot of engagement, don't get a lot of uptake. It's hard to get people to do open peer review, but I'm not necessarily seeing that as failure, right? This is what a lot of people do. A lot of people say, okay, it's not working, we can't get the people, but it takes time to make these changes. And I adamantly believe that it's needed to try out and test these kind of models and to work and to make it more visible also, right? Because a lot of this is around visibility. And about showing all the work that actually happens that normally isn't visible within both research and publishing, and recognizing that. And I'm not the biggest fan of, you know, again, turning that into kind of alternative metrics, etc. I don't think that that's a solution, but it's definitely about normalizing the fact that scholarship is a collaborative endeavor, and that it's hard to get engagement within the system that we have currently, and that moving towards a new system might take time, and that it's not necessarily a failure if it's not working now. Let's just say it like that. Yeah.
Okay. And connected to that, I want to ask Britt, we're wondering if you found on your research if there's a price to pay or negative consequences, right, to putting out to creating an experimental dissertation, because usually before publishing and moving to experimental publishing, as researchers, we have to first write or create a dissertation. So have you found any negative consequences during your research?
Thanks so much for the question. So I will just begin by saying that I am also interested in what counts as scholarship, what counts as knowledge, and so forth. And the way that I looked at that was through the route of the dissertation, because it was one of the best ways I could kind of create boundaries, because otherwise I would be working on my own dissertation forever. And, you know, so
yeah.
Of course, when we're talking about a doctoral dissertation, there are very real risks of the dissertation not being passed. Hands down, that is depending on where you are, that might look a little different. So whether you're going to a defense with an external that you don't know, or whether, I was surprised to learn that in most, if not all, universities in the US versus Canada and the UK, the external isn't, it's totally different. So the person will work with the doctoral candidate will work with their committee throughout, and the external may not necessarily, may be from the same university. Whereas for me, I didn't know the external, they didn't know me, we have not talked about, and for another participant, even the supervisor didn't know the external. It was a completely anonymous, right? So let's start by going there, by saying that the risks are going to vary depending on that kind of assessment.
Right.
But honestly, I want to just say that the negative consequences for doctoral candidates are really I think globally felt for scholars regardless. It's, am I going to be published? Am I going to be recognized? Is this going to be legible? And what I have found, and not just based on my research with actual people, but also just from a lot of engagement with the literature, is that it's strategic. It's really about being strategic with our communication strategy, but also the policies that are in place, right? So this is harkening back to what I said earlier. Like, let's look back at that institutional departmental level piece, right? So if the policies that are in place are stipulating that the dissertation is, must be single authored, must be must be printable, like mine, has a de facto policy in place. They wouldn't call it a policy, but I mean, what is it if not, if you can only submit your dissertation in a PDF form and there's no other, then, that's a policy. So those are the sorts of things that we want to take a look at: tenure and promotion policies, guidelines around that sort of thing. So, are we going to be legible? Are we going to be read? To what extent, you know? And then it's so with the people that I interviewed and all the dissertations that I analyzed over 70 different dissertations. I would say 50 of which, based on the rubric and the sort of criteria that I use, could be considered unconventional. What it is important to understand is that anytime we're doing something that's kind of different, anytime we're deviating from this well-worn path, that's unconventional and puts us at risk of failure. Now, because I'm a writing studies, genre studies, rhetoric person, I understand that writing is not just form. Form is but one way that we express ourselves. And yes, a lot of the unconventional dissertations do play with form. So they're born digital, they're a series of podcasts and so forth, but there are other levels at play. And depending on what our context and our situation is and how much leverage we have, so are we a person who's going to be able to push back on a policy? Can we take that risk? What support do we have and so forth? We might play with the different kinds of ways that we can push the conventions. So whether that's at the playing with the linguistic textual level of things, so how we word. So one of the dissertations I looked at was written by an Indigenous scholar here in Canada who was just like, I'm just going to eschew punctuation. I'm going to deprivilege the English translation of words. I'm not even going to stick to a consistent translation of my words, which I'm like, brilliant. This is great. This is one way that you can kind of push back and decenter the sort of standard edited academic English and other academic conventions. But this person's dissertation was still printed. And that was what made sense for them. And they also negotiated it so that there was a preface that opened the dissertation that started out in more or less quite conventional terms and then kind of got looser. Wow. And so that was also this sort of negotiation that was happening. So if we can think about, so I would say, let's try to pull away from thinking about academic writing, publishing, research, failure, success in monolithic terms. It's so much more complicated, right, to do that. But if we can, as best we can, think about it less as a monolith. Academic writing, publishing is not one thing. The system doesn't work 100%, but sometimes it does. Sometimes I really just appreciate having an article where I know where to go for methods, where I know because it's important to what I do as an academic. And sometimes I don't want that. I want to look at nothing. I want to listen. Give me the podcast, right? So what I want to think about is diversity and pluralism and seeing differences as resources, as again, as a valid way of being, seeing diversity as a valid way of being, versus again, and trying to unsettle this sort of this monolithic terms. So for those of you who are listening, I don't know how many unconventional dissertators are listening, but I would really encourage you to get in touch with me if you're in one of the situations, where you're like, how do I negotiate this? Because I'm still working on how to take my dissertation and put it into outputs that make sense for somebody who's not employed, right? That's the other thing too, like the labor and such. Yes, so just again, the biggest one is ones that you folks are all talking about here. It's legibility. Is this going to count? And that is the same for most people who are not in sort of tenured positions or whatever the equivalent is.
Thank you, Britt. I want to ask the last question to Annika in a couple of minutes, or responding within 2 minutes, so that we have time for the audience to also ask questions. Because one of the important parts of the DH work, projects, dissertations, any of these experiments, when we make them, something that we're not used to when we are, I don't know, reading a novel to write a paper about it, a final project for a class or whatnot. We're not used to, we take notes, but that is not part of documentation. We don't do, we take notes to write a paper, but we are not writing a documentation with those notes, right? But on DH project, we do. So how can we use documentation and in what instances to better communicate how we are doing the experiment, why we're doing it in these steps, right? And if it comes to not giving us the results that we were expecting to, how can that documentation help us still prove that we did we still did a good job at the end of the day. We did the work. It just we had some hypotheses and then we had something different as a result. How can we use documentation?
Yep. Thank you for this question. It's actually quite funny because a couple of years ago I was hired to do a lot of training for researchers in data management, because that's a big thing. At least we're always a bit late in Norway. So while the world was doing open science and data, whatever, not here. So it took us a while to also embark on that journey, but we're going really strong. I have been teaching documentation as a very practical thing, and when I talk about it, I talk to people, if you think about what you're doing, be kind to yourself in the future and to write down what you are doing, why you are doing it, where you are doing it, and what for. So documentation first and foremost for oneself, to keep track of what is going on. What am I investigating? Why am I doing it? Today I did X, what was the outcome? Because you might get distracted for 2 weeks because you have a sick child, or something else happens and then you don't know where you were. So I think that it's a very crucial thing to do. However, it is also something that is incredibly time consuming and requires a lot of personal discipline, and also a lot of not necessarily personal, but kind of professional setting where you are allowed to take the time to do that. And you also need a certain kind of period where you train yourself becoming that disciplined and kind of making it a daily practice. Funnily enough, I had a conversation on the social network platform Mastodon lately, a couple of colleagues from Germany, about how do we do project documentation, and talking about kind of task trackers and so. And I said, you know, the easiest thing you can do, it's still not easy as a task in itself, but it's relatively low tech, is writing a log, a daily log. This is what I have to do today. This is how I progressed on certain things. This was a good idea. This was something a colleague said. And you do that and you progress and you progress and you progress. Don't do any fancy things. So this form of documentation, the human readable documentation in a format that a computer can parse. So these kind of things, or you have a hard time seeing, I've been scribbling notes while the conversation was going on. It might be human readable, or not, but it certainly isn't readable by a computer. So if you ever need to hand over a project or someone wants to pick it up, I think it's crucial that this is in a format that can be understood by other people, including machines. So this is kind of a kind of core element. And then I wanted to kind of pick up on a conversation. I think Janneke talked about it, but also you talked a little bit about it, Britt. And that is the kind of the relation between the data stuff that we're doing, the collection, the pruning and the tidying, and then the publication. And I think there is a shift, and we should be careful that we jump on that train in the digital humanities. And that is, what is the appendix to what? Is my data the appendix to my monograph, or is my monograph the appendix to my data? Talking about reuse, of course, what do you reuse? I mean, we reuse monographs, but not to that extent. We cite them, we quote them, we refute them. But it's actually the things that we are collecting, we might want to call them data, and what we've been doing to it to make it make sense in the context of our investigation. So having that in a good format and documenting what it is, how it came to being, how did I collect it, and then using that as the kind of main publication. So speaking about unconventional dissertations, I would have loved to submit my collection of bibliographic references for my dissertation, and then just had the articles I published as some kind of, if you want to read something about it, read that, because that's the actually important part. It's the kind of core of it all, and it disappears in articles, because who is reading all these footnotes? As a German academic, we're doing footnotes, so that's where all the stuff is. So so thinking about this aspect, and in regards to failure, because that is something that is probably most reusable from your research than a couple of blog posts or partly half-written articles or whatever not we're producing.
Well, thank you. As Jane Winters is pointing out on the chat, I think all of us love the formulation or the question about what is the appendix to what? Is the data the appendix to the monograph, or is the monograph the data to the or is the monograph the appendix to the data, right? I love that as someone who sometimes for fun and to ask a couple of questions. I collect data, I curate it, but then I don't write an article about it. And in that case, it will be the article will be the appendix to the data, certainly. So I also love that. Since we are past the hour, so we have like 20 minutes left or so for Q&A by the audience, I want to open the floor to all of those who are attending to ask questions to our panelists, whether it is on the chat or if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to do so. Please raise your hand so that not two people don't speak at the same time, maybe. Let's see. Let's give them a few seconds to think about a question. Because I have questions, but I don't want to take the entire thing for my questions. Okay, Jane Winters is saying, I'd be really interested in the panel's thought on timelines of failure. When is it failure, and when is it something that just was not successful yet? Oh, that's a good point. When is it failure, it's not successful yet? How can you tell the difference between, I guess, the endpoint of some experiment and still having room to keep working on it to see where it gets, and maybe still fail or get the results that we wanted or that we were hoping that we will get, because we sometimes don't know. That's a good question. Who wants to take the risk of responding to this very good question? How can we distinguish? Britt?
Well, I'll just go really quickly because this is something that I asked myself in a similar but sort of different terms, was you know, with regards to unconventional dissertations that, you know, end up sort of becoming a lot more conventional, so to speak, and you know, so there's a lot of emphasis on the audience and the community, the readers, when it comes to writing studies. Writers don't exist in a vacuum. We're writing for somebody, we're writing for a reason. And so, you know, if the audience doesn't understand what's going on, if there's, you know, is that a failure? And there's a lot of sort of, you know, I don't know, a lot of responses, a lot of a tendency to go towards like, yes, you know, the writer didn't succeed. But I also sometimes wonder, well, what about timing and this sort of kairos and such, you know, kairos being the sense of, we have chronos and kairos, chronos being chronological time, kairos being more like a qualitative opening. And in rhetoric, there's this sense of when, you know, being in the right time, the right place with the right thing, saying what needs to be said. And is there just a mismatch that's happened there? You know, I think of people who have come before, revolutionaries and so forth, who have just been so misunderstood in their times. And then it's like really like 20 years later, we're like, oh my gosh, you know, we're just all ready for it. So it doesn't answer your question, but it is something that I can say I struggled with myself. And all I can say is that in my situation with the specific data set that I was working with, there was a very real pressure to make sure the audience understood, right? Because you don't, there was a lot of sort of tension around that. And so a failure in that case would be that that they lost their examiners, that they lost their supervisors, that and that would be something that it was like, it doesn't matter, we just got to get this through. So there was sort of like a kind of a practical component, but that's not to say that the same people didn't return back to that work and their original point and then try to push it later on. Like I have references with people who I interviewed who are now pursuing the writing via weaving, communicating their knowledge via tapestry and stuff like that. Whereas before it was like they couldn't even, there was no, kind of thing. So.
Gabby, you had your hand ready to respond there to that same question.
Just a sort of almost grotesquely pragmatic answer to Jane's question, which is if for example you're working on a funded project and you've run out of funding, then at that point you can't keep going forever, right? It's a failure, not just not successful yet, unless you go off and get food fund. If you've been writing your dissertation for 3 years already, you have to stop and call it, and justify your failure rather than keep trying. And so it's but I think it is but I'm sort of preempting the next question, but I think it is important to tell us about that failure, right? I mean, that's especially if you're 3 years into writing, you can't just say, okay, I'll drop the bit that failed, because then you've only got 5,000 words of your dissertation. You have to write the whole thing talking about that. So I think it has to become part of the research output in that, which again can sort of be preempting the fact that it's the end of the process rather than the middle of the process. Or...
Right. Janneke, you wanted to say something too?
Yeah, I was thinking about, timelines wide from a publishing perspective. I think it's just incredibly contextual, right? It depends on the specific project, and specifically also the kind of what we want when we do an experiment, what kind of needs we're trying to fulfill. And a lot of the time, I mean, we're working with a lot of the times we're trying to reimagine workflows, like how we're doing things, and a lot of it just means a lot of tweaking that's ongoing, right? So you'll never get that right. It's an iterative process again of testing and trying out. But also, yeah, indeed, like what Gabby is saying around pragmatism, it's not only funding, I think it's also just energy and workload, and at what point, and I see that a lot myself. I support a lot of different projects, and it goes in ups and downs. I'll have a bit of time to work on something, and then I don't, and that's not a failure. It doesn't mean that the project is ended or has failed. It just means that people move to other things. We're in a really high performing environment in which we're output, and sometimes we need to move on, and we come back to things, right? So I think there's this timeline in that sense is a bit it's not always clear from the start what things are going to be, and we might pick up things that we started at some point, and we all have this like projects that we'd love to come back to, but we just don't have the time now, right? And I think this happens a lot. It doesn't mean that a project is failing in that sense. It just needs its own time and its own context to develop, I guess.
Thank you. This, I guess, ties very well with Ariane's question. Speaking of failure timeline, Ariane is asking that what happens if you use a DH methods, in their case, clustering of images with a neural network, and at the end of it, I mean, not at the end, but when you get the data, right? You run the entire process, you realize it was the wrong method because you can't analyze your data and you know why. So you actually know why the method didn't work and why it failed. It didn't fail, because in that case, at least for me, because you run it and you know why it didn't work. So Ariane is asking, is it a failure that you should include in your work at all? I get, like Janneke just said, I guess it's contextual, right? Britt is saying in the chat, could it become a chapter or the focus of an article, of the dissertation, of a book? And Ariane is adding, it took me some time to understand that the fact why it doesn't work is kind of state of the art. I would also say write about it, like, but I'm gonna let Nabeel and Annika wait that.
Nabeel, you should go first. I've talked already a lot, so please.
All right, sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do as a field, and this is something that a lot of the panelists have talked about, right, is these sort of alternative publishing platforms. So I think one of the ways that you still want to get that information out there. So whether that's through some sort of blog or tweet or toot or whatever on Mastodon, you know, it's important to talk about the sort of ways in which because you're saying that, you know, it's kind of state of the art on why it doesn't work. So you can actually contribute, I think, significantly, because I've tried to do stuff like, you know, neural networks to cluster images. So if you have some sort of, you know, ways of understanding why that doesn't work in a situation, that I think is really important to scholarship, because it saves other people time and sort of understanding that. And the second thing is, you know, a lot of this is also up to publishers of our field. So I'm thinking about journals like the Journal of Cultural Analytics, that has a distinct policy to publish null results or results that are failure. And so there are venues in which that kind of work is not only valued in sort of a traditional way, right? But, you know, I think I think it can be valued in sort of a traditional way, but even if you didn't go that path, there's a lot of ways in which you can publish that and make it useful for people. Because ultimately, I think we want to be useful to people on the research we do, not necessarily, you know, and then academics kind of leads us to having pressures of how we're publishing stuff and stuff like that, so.
Now, if I may add my 2 cents on that, because it made me think of what Britt has been talking about, performing failure. I mean, if we take the opportunity here and say, okay, this is something I should publish, and it feels like it's almost a consensus of this panel that, yeah, sure, we want to read about that. But think about it for yourself. Is so you have this sunken cost fallacy that, okay, you have tried this, it didn't work, it failed, but you feel like, okay, spend time on that, and I kind of want to have something in return for the time I spend on it. So I'm going to spend more time on making it to an article that then, instead of discussing what you actually want to do, discussing what you did and why it didn't work. And I think we might also want to consider just letting it go. And because that, again, without wanting to go into this other aspect of the failure performance with reinterpreting everything as a success, like, oh, I learned something here. I mean, of course, you learned something in the process. Thus, we don't need really to talk about it, but that you can let it go. There are many things that don't lead to anything. They happen all the time, every day. It's not necessary. I mean, we're talking about publishing. There is so incredibly much publishing. There are so many things you could read. It would just add up a pile. So maybe communicating failures of this kind can also be not communicating them and just letting it pass for yourself as some kind of exercise of, okay, deep breath, next thing. Maybe that's also an approach we might want to consider.
Thank you. Anyone else has any question, a new one or something related to these responses?
Do you mind if I just add really quickly to what I was just sort of going back to that idea of the timeline, and you know, I think there's that sense of chronological timeline, and that's a very that's just one paradigm and way of thinking about time and of learning. There's a lot of other people out there on this planet who who think of learning across the lifespan. And so, you know, in terms of this idea of letting go, which is all very, very smart and practical, you know, we just don't know how something might come back later on anyways. I mean, it may or may not, but I certainly have found that I've been surprised when things that I've failed to publish on, had no expectation to publish on, later on just pop back in, and suddenly now I have found their way in a really useful, meaningful way for me, that really enriches my scholarship, whether or not it's publication or such later on. So and I'm talking like 8 years later, sort of thing. So it's not by, you know, of course now we're talking about the pressures, like what that comes into contact with, like, well, yeah, but I need to finish my PhD, or I need a job, or these other things as well. But yes, that's just a kind of another thought there too.
Thanks, Britt. Nabeel, you have your hand. No. Okay.
That's just my inability to work computers. It's a failure on my part.
Good one. Anyone else has a question? If not, I have a final one for everyone. No. Well, okay, I will take the 4 or 3 minutes that we have left to ask the final question I was going to ask, when we were discussing, you were answering to a few questions. And first, thank you for sharing your experiences with all of us here in the room. Very different perspectives, different contexts, which is very important to situate ourselves in different contexts that we are where we are, and be aware of other contexts out there. My last question is, what is one piece of advice each of you will give very quickly for new students in particular, or the new people entering DH and whatnot, so that they can embrace changing the focus on the I need a final product. I need a final product. This is how I succeed, right? Embracing the process, whether it is failing along the way, creating documentation, which is important throughout the process, so that, as Sam Grant puts it in his book, we can all fail gloriously. And I like that little phrase. We can fail gloriously, so that when we fail, it's not seen as a radical thing that we are publishing about our failure, right? It's just we're being honest about it, and we are finally okay with it. It's okay to not get to the point where we were hoping to get, because the method didn't work out. We ran out of funds. We changed focus on our research. We had some emergency come up, whatever it is. We had a pandemic, right? How do we start to embracing the process and not just the final product for students? Who wants to go first?
I can start. I think one of the big things that I would say is to kind of show your work throughout the process of doing stuff, even if it's not the final product. I think there's a huge benefit in sort of getting over the initial fear of like, this is not a perfect product, which is something that you have to learn throughout academia. But if you're a new scholar, I think there's a couple of ways you can do that, where, like, you know, one, you have to sort of put in this first peer-reviewed article or whatever, and then that can have a lot of kind of fear attached to it. And I just think that it's important to sort of keep up and stay in the conversation with people, whether that again is through like blogging or tweeting or whatever you have, just to let people know what you're working on, because I find that I get a lot of ideas and sort of motivation and in working with that, knowing that there's a lot of people that, you know, have also failed at a lot of things and seem to be doing fine.
If I may continue, if I have to give advice, I rarely have students around me. I have lots of senior researchers around me who I give advice to. But advice for a student would be try to find a safe senior person, someone who Britt has been writing in the chat can be a mentor, and ask them about their professional failures, so that you see that these people who have made it in the system are not perfect, that this happens, it's a normal thing, but it needs to be a safe person, because otherwise you will not want to share. It's a very vulnerable situation. So it's at the same time an advice to all these senior people: be that safe person for a student. When you teach, tell them about everything that failed in your research recently, big things, small things. So that would be my piece of advice.
Janneke, yeah.
Just to follow on, I think that those are already amazing responses. I think just to, I mean, this is advice that's not always easy, right? Because especially now, you know, in what we've had with the pandemic, with specific localities of where people are. But I would always say to people is to try and find a community to which you connect. And that can be a local community, it can be a discipline, it can be, you know, when I did my PhD, I bonded a lot with dance PhD students, because they were doing the kind of more wacky work that I was doing, right? Not necessarily my discipline, or, but it's about that. It's about finding people where you feel comfortable with, to share your work with, and to try out things together. And I wish that I could say that the whole academic community was like that, and unfortunately it isn't, right? But I do really believe in that we can do this on a smaller scale with communities that we're part of, or forming these kind of communities of also seeing research as something that we do collaboratively, and that we work on collaboratively to make things better, to improve it, to make it the best it can be, right? Which will include things going wrong, and being open for that, and helping each other when it does, and being there for each other. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the answer I was going to give would be almost exactly the same as what both Annika and Janneke have both just said, which is if you're entering the digital humanities, then it's a really friendly discipline. People will be really accepting of negative results, of things that look like failures, of experimental publications, of things that you know that can't just be distributed in the normal way, the things that are weird. The caveat being, if you're coming along to use digital humanities in some other discipline, that may not still be true for the other discipline. And I'm not saying it isn't, but you know, check, because the whole world, as Janneke just said, that the world isn't always as nice as we want it to be.
And the last thing I was just going to add was, it was sort of I'm just thinking a lot of my friends and the people that I love whose failures are really a lot more to do with being in a Black body, in a racist context, or an Indigenous body, queer body, disabled body. I would also say find people who have not succeeded in the conventional terms, people who are maybe not considering themselves academics, or people who have left the academy, and to ask why that is, because I think it's really important to understand that sometimes the failures that these people might be experiencing are not their failures. They never were their failures. They don't need to own those failures. And really, it's actually on the institution to ask itself, how are we failing these students? And I think that's kind of really been like the thread that's coming through my talk overall. But I think what happens is, when we look at the scholars who have been successful in their scholarship and what failures they have, rarely it seems, well, I should be a bit more careful with how I say this, but I just want to make sure that there's also attention that's being given to these other dimensions that are often hidden, and maybe not because they're not being considered as failures as such, not in a traditional kind of term, but they very much are. So that's just the only other thing I would say. The textual mentor, the real life mentor, both, you know, in terms of being within the academy and beyond, I think it's good to have a wide diversity of mentors, all of the mentors. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that. I think we are 5 minutes past the seminar hour. So thank you, everyone. I want to reiterate how grateful we are for all of you for sharing your experiences with us. Thanks for everyone who joined. I'm gonna allow Ana Maria to close the session. She was the one organizing it. But on my part, thank you, everyone. This was delightful.
Many thanks to you, Jen, also for chairing fantastically this session. I mean, it was such an interesting topic, and I think that we covered like so many aspects of it. So many thanks to all participants, but